Welcome to episode 6 of the Polypath. This evening, we are going to venture into the groves of symbols with writer, academic, anthropologist, writer of fiction, writer of studies of mythology and folklore, Melinda Reidinger. Melinda, you're very welcome as our first real guest on the podcast. I've had some guests that were already in the can that I trotted out. But you are the first one that I am interviewing for this particular series in real time. How are you doing?
Good. Thank you for the invitation, Mark.
Well, the occasion of this invitation is that your book, The White Deer, has just been released. It is now available. Where can people get this book, Melinda?
The book is published by Ratona Press, and people can go to their webpage, abeautifulresistance.org, and they will find it for sale among the other books published by Reed Wildermuth and Gods and Radicals.
So this is a book that I was just looking up my files. I had the pleasure of reading it and responding to it. Just about a year ago, we were talking about it. And in the months previous to that, I think about a year ago, you finished the book, and it was really an amazing journey, talking about it, thinking about it. And it's a book for our times about the figure of the white deer in folklore, in legend, in mythology, in tradition, and in ecology. It's a wide-ranging book. But before we start really getting into the meat of talking about your writing, because you also write fiction, you're also a college professor. Before we get into that, I want to ask you, I'm going to test this, right? This is going to be my initial question to people. So you're going to tell me how it goes. How about, what is your relationship to magic?
It's a great question. And I suppose it's one that I might answer a little bit differently each day. To me, magic is an integration of fields in a complex way that transcends what we're able to understand at a given time. So I'm not trying to be completely woo-woo and spooky about that, but I'm trying to say that when a person has the intention of doing some magic, the more they can draw in from folklore, from their own emotions, from their history, from their intentions, from materials that they gather around them, the more connection they can make to beings that are present around them, the more effect it's going to have. But because you're multiplying your forces or multiplying the effective principles, the results are always a little bit unexpected, a little bit surprising. So I suppose that cultivating magic is cultivating the ability to be surprised.
Oh,
And that means working in a lot of these different fields separately.
that is absolutely a wonderful phrase. Cultivating the ability to be surprised. I love it. And I think that what you say is very interesting because it is so in line with your approach, funnily enough, as an academic, is that it draws on all of these different fields. You know, it's not just one thing. It's not just, here's what I believe is the thing that works. No, it's like, no, you multiply your forces by it's like an interdisciplinary, weaving together different strands, right?
Yes, and you bring them into conversation, and the things that they say can surprise you, even when you're doing academic work.
I think that's really
I disagree.
it's really important to me as well, because that, one of the things that people tend to, I think, mistakenly believe or maintain is that both in academia in being a scholar and in magic, they expect consistent results. They're like, okay, I'm going to go and do a study on X, Y, or Z, but they already know what they're going to find. So, of course, they find it. And similarly, they're like, oh, I'm going to do X, Y, or Z operation, which has been proven to do X, Y, or Z results. And if it doesn't get those exact results, then I must have done it wrong. But that's not how it works. And as you say, it's about there are so many factors. It's a complex system. Surprise is fundamental.
It's fundamental because what you're talking about sounds like Crowley's definition of magic, that it's accomplishing change and conformity with will, right? I
Hmm.
mean, if it worked that way, it would be science. And
Exactly.
if you're doing academic work that way, well, you probably have a rich sponsor for your science
It's
because you're
true. And
producing the
also,
results that they asked you to find.
exactly, because they will give you your hypothesis and then ask you to go and prove it. And of course you will, because if you choose your evidence, you can prove pretty much anything.
Yes.
So when you go into, it sounds like when you go into a magical operation or a piece of scholarly research, you're going in there not knowing what you're going to find. It's actually you're exploring. You're looking for something, but you don't know what.
I'm drawn in by a topic. There has to be a starting point.
Hmm.
And sometimes what I end up with is quite different than what the starting point, began with. In the case of the white deer, I began with the figure of the white deer itself. I was inspired to learn more about this motif, and it suddenly branched out into all these fields that you named, into history, into literature, into art, into cave art, into human evolution. I just was able to draw strands from everywhere until it started to look like that meme of the guy with the charts all over the walls, the crazy red lines
Yeah,
connecting things.
yeah,
And you do that. That
or
that's
the
it. It's
ramifying
inductive.
the ramifying antlers of the deer itself, right? But if I
Yes.
can ask, you say that it was the figure of the white deer, the image of the white deer. Was there a moment? Is there a primal scene to this exploration? Is there a particular image, either in literature or visually, or in a dream or in reality? Did you ever come across this figure of the white deer? Can you pinpoint the moment that you looked at it and said, "Huh, there's something here"?
Well, I can tell you what inspired me to write the first version of this work.
Hmm,
I had read Robin Artison's book, An Cara Gwyn, which means in Caernarvon, in a Cornish language, the white deer.
right.
Now, his book is really about a system of witchcraft that he has developed, but he does tell a few white deer myths. And so I was involved in a group of people who were reading this book, and Robin suggested, why don't we take some elements of the book that interested us and, find out more about it and write a short essay. So I thought, all right, well, that's a great idea. So
Mm,
I looked into the myth of the white deer, and that was what drew me. But whether there's sort of an Ur myth or some absolutely fundamental scene, no, I don't think so. But I do think that encountering this animal is it's a mind-stopping moment of wonder, and I think that is the starting point, really. And not that there was this or that lead up situation or this or that outcome. I mean, there are typical stories. I trace this, in the book in great detail. But I do think that it's the encounter itself, and there's a visceral reaction to it. And I met a white deer just this past winter for the first
um,
time in nature, not one that was behind an enclosure or that had been bred specially. And it was, like I said, a mind-stopping moment of wonder.
that's another very beautiful phrase, a mind-stopping moment of wonder. And perhaps you could, it's one of those things that sounds almost like, well, that goes beyond words. It's mind stopping. We can't say what that is. But you said that you came face to face. I mean, interestingly, after you'd written the book, right? You finally saw a real one in
Yes.
the wild. Um, t- Describe the scene.
I can't tell you too much about where this took place because I'm concerned about the safety of the deer. I
Right.
wouldn't like to reveal where this animal roams. But I was with some friends. We were in a car, and the friend who was driving slammed on the brakes and said deer, right? Because there were several of them, but one of them was white. It was a doe, and she stopped right in front of the car. She looked at us. We looked at her. She walked over to the side of the road, and then she bounded away with the rest of the herd.
Wow. So she did. So there was that moment. There was that moment of looking at each other.
Yes, yes. Just like in a Ted Hughes poem that I refer to in the book. I was unable to quote the poem in its entirety because of copyright issues. So I had to make do with just a few snippets here and there.
Yeah. It's
Interestingly, in the poem, it's not clear whether Hughes is walking or driving when he encounters deer. They're not white deer, but it's this same idea of time stops for a moment. And there's this beholding between the observer and the observed. And the man and the deer are both at the same time, but the landscape itself is alive.
yeah.
Hughes has a wonderful way of depicting that.
Yeah.
And these
He's
are
really
moments that seem to stand outside of time, and that's why you feel a touch of the other world. And then whatever your culture believes about the other world and who lives in it and why you're being contacted, that can vary. But you feel that touch once time stops.
absolutely. I think that those those moments of recognition of, as you say, beholding is a lovely way to put it. And there are there are certain places, there are certain landscapes, there are certain landmarks. There are definitely certain animals more than others. I mean, I think you can have it with any given animal, but animals that are perhaps particularly rare or particularly that stand out. And of course, a deer is always, I think, something that seems so fleeting, that seems so um, uh, ungraspable, that if you see one and it stops and looks at you, you feel special. But when it's the white deer, that's even more so, right?
I think so, yes. A deer has very sharp senses. So you have to expect that the deer is aware of you before you're aware of it.
Yeah.
So it does seem like it's almost making a choice
Yeah.
to share presence with you. Of course, cars change that dynamic somewhat because they appear so suddenly that the deer's senses may not alert it in time when it's already decided, it's going to cross the road or it's going to jump out of the bush or something like that.
Mm.
So, of course, drivers need to be alert, especially at night in rural areas like we are. So, most of the local people really do try to drive carefully at night for this reason:
Yeah,
deer, wild pigs, other creatures.
absolutely. And I think it was one of the things that really that I found really moving as well about your work was that I myself, for the first time in my life, was living in a place where I was likely to run into deer and wild boar and foxes and hares, whereas I had always lived in urban areas, all my life. Um,
Mm.
so it was only in the past couple of years, actually for me, it coincides with lockdown, that I came to live in the southwest of France, and I was living in a place where just out the back of where we lived, I could see deer. I could see, and I did. And those encounters, which I'd never really had the chance to have, um, I think they really changed the way that I related to the natural world. Because as you say, it's one thing to go for a walk in nature, but it's another thing to see and be seen.
Yes, yes. And it's drawing levels of complexity because around you there's deer consciousness, there's fox consciousness. And when you live in the country, you start to think about that. Am I going to encounter a wild pig? Do I need to be concerned about meeting wild pigs? If I'm driving, do I need to be concerned about deer and bighorn sheep and other animals?
Yeah.
When I'm out for a walk with, I have two wolf dogs, I need to be aware of what they're doing, that they don't cause harm to animals that we might encounter.
Now, as you say that, maybe it might be interesting to for a moment, kind of back up a little and just say, so you you do live in a rural area, and in fact, you live in a rural area of the Czech Republic. So it's not just any rural area.
Yes.
You, like myself, are an immigrant, expatriated, etc. And you live in a rural area in the Czech Republic, which I think when people, certainly people in kind of like Anglophone culture, when we hear that, there is a kind of a romantic kind of like, ooh, dark forests, ooh, kind of Central Europe kind of feel, right? Um, are you kind of over that, or do you still feel it a bit?
No, I'm still in love with the romance of this place. I mean, when people ask me, about where, oh, you live in Prague, right? I'm like, oh no, oh no, this is worlds away from Prague. It's only 50 kilometers ish. But there's like 13 households in my village.
Oh wow,
There's a firehouse. There's no store. There's no post office. There's no pub. The only other facility that exists here besides the firehouse is a distillery where they make fruit brandies, and that's private.
right. And
Um,
you mentioned
wild,
country.
wild pigs run across the village square. There are more farm animals than people.
Oh wow.
More like, yeah.
You mentioned very briefly, and I want to just kind of underline it for people because I think it's such a cool fact is that you have two wolf dogs. Now, what is a wolf dog?
Well, a wolf dog generally is a hybrid between wolves and dogs. And this particular breed is called a Czechoslovakian wolf dog, and they were developed by the Czechoslovak Border Guard Service in the 1950s. The intention was that they would help the soldiers guard the borders, which meant preventing people from escaping the Iron Curtain.
Oh,
So these were the soldiers who were tasked, shooting their country people in the back when they were trying to climb over barbed wire. And so they developed these wolf dogs. And the reason was they wanted the obedience and trainability of German shepherds, but they wanted the sharper senses of a wolf.
right.
And they thought that they would get a more vicious nature, but they were quite mistaken. What they got instead was an extremely loyal animal that was devoted to whoever raised it and handled it. And they found it was unsuited for border guard service because it wasn't vicious. And because whoever raised it from a puppy, that was their pack mate. And they did not adapt to changing hands when people rotated out of service. So
Um,
the breed has persisted, but it's used in other ways, or simply people keep them as pets
mm.
and companions.
That is so fascinating because when you said about what the history was, and that almost designed as a weapon, like they were almost designed as a sort of a super guard dog, and the fact that like that's totally not what happened. I think that betrays partly the misconceptions about what wolves are and what wolves' nature is that are in our society, right?
Yes, it certainly does. And that is, in fact, my next project. I have proposed to research and write a book, and I've asked for funding from the American National Endowment for the Humanities to support this research. So I would like to talk about the relationships between wolves and humans and The title of the proposed work is A Wolf to Man, which comes from the Latin expression, man is a wolf to man. But the Latin expression makes reference to wolves being predatory and the assumptions that they're vicious.
Right.
But in fact, when we use wolves to characterize other human beings, that isn't always the assumption.
Mm.
It is the assumption with the phrase, but when we name youth groups Cub Scouts, the idea isn't that they're going to simply, engage in a war of all against all. It's that they're going to pack bond and cooperate and learn together, the way young wolves do.
Yeah, because I think that you know, perhaps even more than the figure of the white deer, the figure of the wolf, and I mean, you saw that segue, right? Like smooth. Um, but the figure of the wolf is one that is so permeating in our culture. Like, I remember having this reflection when I was when my son Liam was 1.5, 2 years old, and as soon as he could talk, the big bad wolf was a figure in his life, because the big bad wolf, and he was learning first in French, so it was le grand méchant loup. So it's not just in English, it's in French, it's in like every country where there are wolves. So all of Europe for a start. um, for him, the wolf was a figure in his mind, in his life, in his imagination, and it wasn't just frightening. I mean, I remember him and his kids, his fellow um, sort of classmates in creche, all running, screaming into the corner together, going, "The wolf, the wolf, the wolf!" Now, of course, they were having fun, like they were enjoying being scared of the wolf. But then Liam, he loved the story of the Three Little Pigs, particularly, and he loved Little Red Riding Hood, but particularly Three Little Pigs. But sometimes when we would play the Three Little Pigs, he would be a little pig, and sometimes he'd be the wolf. And so the wolf became, for him, not just the personification. I think it was his first representation of entropy, of death, of loss, of the darkness, like
Mm.
danger, but it was also a way of playing that role himself. And I thought, wow, this kid isn't even two yet. And so the fact that you say that this is your next project, I think um, your way of dealing with it, drawing on all of your resources of um, both the kind of imaginative and literary side, but also the anthropological side, but also the ecological side, um, and the fact that you literally live with wolf hybrid animals. I think it's an amazing project. I think it's going to be great. Um, how does it differ, would you say,
Thank
from
you.
writing White Deer?
Well, the wolf is familiar to us in ways that the white deer is not. I mentioned the mind stopping moment of wonder when you encounter a white deer. Um, it is rare to encounter a wolf in the wild. Perhaps it will become more common as they are reintroduced to European landscapes. They're starting to be reintroduced in other parts of the world. Um, but we or people tend to encounter dogs every day.
Yeah,
And the dog is simply the domestic form of the wolf. So
right.
there is a certain familiarity, right? Canis lupus familiaris is a dog. And it's
Yeah,
a funny name because Canis, right, is dog. Canis lupus is a wolf. The dog that's a wolf. Canis lupus familiaris is the dog that's the wolf that's our friend or family member. Right?
yeah.
So all these layers of what we
I
call these things. And they keep on going back, referentially.
I'd never thought about that actually. That yeah, it's the dog
So
that the wolf
so
that the hound.
that's our friend. So the project on wolves is going to be less enchanted. Now, when you ask me, about magic and my relationship to it, I could substitute the word enchantment, right? That's an integration of these realms of mind, of culture, of meaning, of nature, right?
Mm,
Um, this book is going to have those elements in it, but it's not going to be really pushing forward the idea that we're meeting with something that transcends the sum of the parts in a spooky way.
Mm-hmm.
And it's partly because I don't think the topic of wolves justifies it as much as the topic of the white deer. It's partly because one aspect of the intention with this is that I do want to demystify things a bit and explain them. And
Mm.
another reason is I'm asking for government funding.
Right.
So I
I
do
see
have
what
to
you mean.
tone that down.
I see what you mean. I think that's actually very interesting. The
Sorry, Mark, your sound broke up. Could you repeat your statement or question, please?
yeah, of course, I can hear a little bit of feedback on my side. I'll try and do what I can afterwards with the sound. But yeah, I think it's very interesting because the white deer, as you say, there is something fundamentally uncanny. There is something fundamentally out of place in that sense that it is a harbinger of enchantment, and it's otherworldly. Like, it is of the other world. It is like an extrusion of the other world into our world when we see it. But the wolf, as you say, has been with us forever. The wolf is part of our world. We have grown up together, you know? Our, our closest companion, perhaps, in
Yes,
terms of animals.
certainly, certainly. Of
Was the
course,
wolf, was the
with
dog
the
the
wolf
first,
eradication,
was it the first domesticated animal?
the dog is the first animal that was, it is, certainly. And there are various theories about what motivated people to domesticate wolves, how it was accomplished, um, what benefits people gained from the partnership with wolves.
And is that something that you'll be going into in the book? Like the theories about the original domestication, sort of almost like a paleo sociology of the wolf.
Yes. I will be discussing theories of human self domestication and what it meant for us in our evolutionary history to become domesticated and to become less of a wild species than we once were.
Hmm.
Obviously, a lot of these are theories and interpretations. And how does that parallel with the domestication of the wolf into dogs? And then what did the cooperation look like thereafter?
How would
But once
you
it was accomplished, sorry.
how would you describe human self-domestication? Because I think it's heard the phrase, but I'm not quite sure exactly what that means.
To put it into slightly technical terms, there's more proactive and less reactive aggression. Reactive aggression is when someone comes along and says, hey, jerk, what are you looking at? Or your mother is, something, and you react with either verbal or physical aggression against that.
Right.
Proactive aggression, on the other hand, is when you band together, either with a couple of friends, and you could be thugs looking for a fight. You could be on a patrol looking for intruders into your territory who might, mean some harm. At the extreme, it might be the Holocaust, right? Where one group of people decides that they need to eliminate another group. There's forethought, there's planning, there's a decision to eliminate somebody or something. So the self domestication process for humanity consisted of the suppression of the proactive aggression to be substituted with, the substitution of the reactive aggression, substituting it with proactive aggression. And it was a direct exchange because in any band of people, there might be that guy,
Mm.
the one who's constantly flying off the handle, who's aggressive, the one who doesn't respect others' integrity or their family relationships or so on. And it said the oldest story in the world is 4 men went hunting and 3 men returned,
Mm.
right? And that's the proactive regression. It is the gradual elimination of certain people from
Oh, wow.
communities and from gene pools. Yeah, so you've got the social element where generation after generation, people are learning, what sort of behavior just is too much, too far, right? But to the extent that there might be a genetic element to it, it's being removed from the gene pool. Not immediately, because sometimes, that guy might have managed to have some children before he's taken into the woods and doesn't return.
I'm actually kind of
So
shocked
eventually,
by what you're saying, because when you said self-domestication, um, I was imagining something more like um, settlements and social and parasocial bonds, and like pair bonding and group dynamics, and what you're saying is that no, it's about preemptive violence. It's all about like being violent before someone else can mess you up. And so domestication was actually militarization, like where they turned into war bands, not just groups.
well, if they remained war bands, then you've got a different dynamic going on. We're talking about, way, way back in the human evolutionary story, where there's one person who's just terrorizing the rest of the group. And some of
Mm.
the others get together and say, we're not having this anymore. We've talked to him, we've reasoned with him, we've explained things. And, there's just simply no getting along with this one.
So it's like Law and Order.
It's the difference between, in a sense, yes. Um, Something like settlements, I mean, that was much later, right? That comes with the Neolithic revolution when people had a reason to settle.
I guess I didn't mean settlements. I guess I meant more like gathering around a campfire, I guess. Like tribe.
The campfire is the campfire absolutely is a crucial moment, because you have people sitting around the fire, which not only cooks their food and keeps them warm, it keeps predators at bay. And since they're sharing close quarters, they do have to, you know, get along a bit
Mm.
better in that setting. And naturally, there'd be storytelling and culture sharing, and it amplified the process of turning us into, well, what we would later call more civilized beings.
Mm. I like the idea that
But it goes way back. Of course, Homo erectus had fire.
sorry?
Homo erectus had fire.
Yes, yes. I like the idea also that perhaps it wasn't just about um eliminating that jerk that's always messing things up, but that it was also about the storytelling. Um, and I think perhaps, um, obviously, this is not my area of expertise by any means, but one might imagine that once you start doing things like making rules and doling out punishments and deciding that somebody has transgressed to a point where they deserve a punishment of fatal violence, that at that point you're going to need stories that are going to justify how you run things. You're going to be like, okay, so here's how things are. Here's what the rules are. Here's who we are. Here's what we do. Here's what we don't do. And that obviously the best way to encode those stories and to share those, like those rules and those conventions, those traditions, would be through mythology, right? Would be through like, here's our story, here's who we are, here's what we believe in, here's what you can do, here's what you can't do, and here's a story about what happened when a human transgressed. The gods punished him. That kind of thing.
Well, um, you've made a good point about this, that sitting around the campfire is going to, sorry, I've lost the thread a little bit. That sitting around the campfire is, going to lead to stories about morals and transgressions and um, um, consequences.
Yeah, exactly. I guess that my point is that like mm, it's easier to it's easier to sell your policing or your kind of like your you're imposing rules on people when they have a narrative. Because I think we notice this even up to today, right? Like when there's two sides to an argument in politics or in a community, it's often the one that has the more compelling story that wins out, not necessarily the one that has the best reasons or the best facts or the best whatever, but the one that has a compelling narrative, or the best slogan or whatever it is. um, that power of storytelling, whether it be in national politics or whether it be in a small village, the person who tells the good story is often the one whose version is going to prevail, right?
Yes, certainly. And generally, the best version or the best narrative is the one that tugs at people's emotions. And
Yeah.
there are certain emotions that are particularly powerful or can be very effectively mobilized for these political purposes. You're probably aware of the work of George Lakoff, a linguist who had described exactly why Donald Trump's narratives were carrying so much sway, even when a lot of his arguments or proposals just, didn't make logical sense. And, he was able to persuade people to vote against their interests and to
Mm,
speak against their own interests. And he did that by mobilizing fear and disgust,
absolutely. Absolutely. And
which the other side, they shrank away from that. And I'm not saying that they should have sunk to the level, but
yeah.
perhaps there needed to be a better way to counter that.
Yeah. I mean, for me, the other example, the other obvious example that comes up is Brexit, because um, Brexit made absolutely no sense to anyone, including the government that originally tabled it. And the fact is that the people who the Leave campaign had this narrative of let's reclaim our sovereignty, right? Now, logically, it makes absolutely no sense, but it was a good story. And for Britain, particularly England, it was a story they've been telling themselves, for decades, centuries, in fact, that they are the sceptred isle, that they are, Albion, the jewel in the sea there. And the thing is, the other side tried to argue with facts and arguments. And they said, don't listen to those elitist experts. Who do they think they are telling you what to think? Which again was a wonderful story that anybody who has a college degree and is an expert in a field shouldn't be telling you about their own field, because they're being elitist, they're being arrogant. So I think that those kind of narrative moves in our society are something that, in a certain way, those of us who study literature, anthropology, art history, folklore, mythology, we tend to think that those disciplines are a little bit ivory towerish sometimes, that they don't have any real world applications, but I fundamentally disagree. When you're doing the kind of work you do, I think that in showing us how to decode the mythical status of a particular figure and how that fits into um, the sociological, anthropological, political, historical, how all of those gears mesh. I think that that is something that is vital to us understanding our current predicament.
I would hope so. Um, I would say that Brexit very much mobilized the same fear and disgust that Trump mobilized with his campaigns. And I would hope that people who have been swayed by those emotions and by the people pulling those strings will be willing to look at other works, other literature, other artwork that might show them a broader perspective that isn't anchored in in these particular emotions, because once someone can make you afraid or can tell you that you're in contact with something that's contaminated, that's disgusting, that's filthy, that's vile,
Mm.
basically they can do whatever they want with you. And we've seen this again and again. We've seen this with the scares over terrorism worldwide. I'm not denying that any such thing existed, but certainly people were led by the nose by governments all around the world. Certainly, we were put into commitments to operations that really didn't make very much sense.
Yeah.
But it was possible to do it by motivating fear and disgust and distrust.
Yeah. I think it is a great.
Something I don't want to elaborate on, but a lot of this was happening during the COVID years as well. But we're going to leave that aside for now.
Of course, of course, and I agree with you that like all of these things, just as you say, um, absolutely, we're talking about real situations, real circumstances, but in every case, these things were instrumentalized in order to use fear to either unite or control, and either unite people against a common
Yeah.
enemy or you mobilize them against a common threat. And in every case, you get the feeling that, again, the power of narrative is being used to manipulate us. And so the fact that I think that, for me as a teacher, um, sometimes my students would ask me, what's the point of studying 19th century poetry, whatever? And I'd say, well, A, it's awesome, but B, studying the methods that someone uses to get a message across, studying the methods not only logical but rhetorical and to do with sound and rhythm and rhyme and metaphor and all of these things. The better you get at decoding them, the better you get at decoding the messages that you hear every day all around you from the media, because better you decode them than you just absorb them without decoding them, right?
Yes, I fully agree with that.
And this is how I argue to people that, that professors of 19th century poetry are actually vital to their survival. What do you think about when we started off with this, and I'd like to move back towards this, sort of to move towards a kind of a, not a conclusion, but a kind of a wrapping up of things. When you do the work that you do, you are exploring, you are discovering, as you said, you are being prepared to find something that surprises you. Now, in that art, is there an element that is magical, or can you draw an analogy between what you do with words and ideas and what you do in a more sort of, let's say, hands in the dirt kind of practice of magical doings?
Interesting question. Not sure I have a great answer for this one right at this time. Might take some
Well,
further
well,
reflection.
yeah, of course, but perhaps let me say, do you, considering the way that you said earlier, your sort of your definition of what magic is, do you think that the
Yes.
manipulation of words, the creation of literature, the creation of books, is that kind of a magical act fundamentally?
It certainly is, because it's adding to the complexity of discussions, right? You're sending a collection of words which has its history and has its sources and origins, and you're putting it into ideally thousands, millions of new contexts, right? Where the words and the ideas meet the readers, and then it starts to interact with their world. Words are
Yeah.
absolutely powerful. And
Yeah.
somebody would ask me, what is the most powerful magical spell I've ever created? Go ahead and ask.
What is the most powerful magical spell you've ever created?
Most powerful magical spell I ever created was changing my self-description on Facebook from translator to writer.
Oh,
And
yeah.
that was the point when the rubber started to hit the road. And whether it had an effect on me, whether it had rippling effects into some ether or the universe or something like this, I cannot say. But from that point forward, I was much more focused on the work of writing. From that point forward, I considered myself a writer.
Mm.
And from that point forward, it seemed like the universe, in every possible frustrating way, was clearing things out of my path so that I could sit down and focus on writing every day, long hours each day. Whether I had translating work to do or didn't have translating work to do, I still sat down and I wrote a dystopian novel concurrently with The White Deer. And when that was finished, I started a novella, a historical novella. And the novella is ready to be edited, and I've got a screenplay that's coming up next.
Well, this is fascinating.
It's much I wish, that I had more paid work to do. I wish that, this circumstance or that circumstance is different. No, sit your ass down and write is what I'm being told. And occasionally I thought, well, should I change that back? Should I describe myself as a freelance editor or, translator or something? No, describing myself as a writer, because that makes it so. That is the most powerful spell I've ever cast. And I didn't use any candles or sigils or crystals or any of that. I simply used a few words.
I think that is
and
amazing.
I surprised myself.
Amazing. That is amazing and surprising and wonderful. And I think that what you did there is absolutely something that people find difficult to do. I think that at least people who actually measure the full meaning of such things, they do find it hard to call themselves an artist, a writer, a poet, whatever it is. Some people use those terms very lightly and they use them very loosely, and it's a bit annoying. But people who measure really what those things mean, they find it the hardest to give themselves that title, that identity. And I think that your relating of how literally it's almost like changing the nameplate on your desk or your door or whatever, changing your title.
Yes.
And I love the idea that that act of self-naming, of self-definition, changed your life because it changed who you were. It changed
It did.
what you were. It changed what you did.
It absolutely did.
And I've seen it, and I think that what is surprising, probably to anybody who reads your work and then talks to you a little bit, is that you only really started writing like this a couple of years ago. Like, it's not like you've spent your whole life writing fiction and nonfiction essays and that only now you've started to get them out there. No, it's like you just sat down one day and said, right, now I'm going to do this. And they emerged, they sprang from your forehead, if you will, very fully formed, I find.
Well, thank you for the compliment to the degree of formation. Yes, I did start this writing spree in February of 2021 after a drug trip. Now, the drugs that I'm talking about came from Emporium Black. Seamus Black sells truffles that contain legal plants. So I'm not talking about consuming anything from the black market, haha, Emporium Black, right?
Right.
not talking about consuming anything that is illegal.
Mm.
Um, but I did take one of the truffles that he sells, and I took a walk and felt a little bit more open to things, a little bit more open to magic, to being surprised, and that sort of thing. Where we live, there's a horse sanatorium in a valley below us.
Mm.
And the horses there, as part of their cure, are allowed to wander freely across the landscape. So you'll see herds of 30 and more horses, and
Oh,
they
wow.
just thunder across the valleys or across the roads freely, and cars have to wait for them.
Hmm.
Sometimes they're a bit rambunctious, and they can occasionally knock a person over. They're not vicious, but they're curious and they wonder if you have treats.
Huh.
So I was walking across the snowy valley, and there was this herd of horses. And they started following me, and then they sped up, and I sped up, and I thought, this isn't good. Like, I'd seen them knock people over, and I was alone. So I sped up, and I saw a gap in the hedgerow, and I, cleared through the gap in the hedgerow and went up into the forest. And the horses, they don't go into that forest. It's on a hill called Burnt Peak, which has a certain interesting kind of energy to it, and the horses don't go there. Anyway, I went through the gap in the hedgerow, went up Burnt Peak, and there's this hunter's blind up at the top of it. It's like a small tower with a seat with a little cabin on top. And I was approaching it, and the way the light and the angle was, it looked like Baba Yaga's hut on chicken legs. And
Mm.
I imagined myself telling this story, escaping from these horses, and then I found Baba Yaga's hut, and there was safety. And I just had this realization, it's all story, it's all narrative, everything is. Now, it's not that I didn't know that before.
Mm.
If anyone would ask me, is narrative important? Sure, I could give a little spiel about it. But I had a just soul deep realization, that yes, this is the way things are. And it changed me. And I became motivated to start writing. And, I wrote a little Facebook post about this encounter. And I shot some pictures of the horses and the hunter's blind and that. And I wrote a story. As I said, this was February of 2021, and this story was called Lupercalia. Lupercalia is an old holiday on the 15th of February. And so the story was referring back to February of the year before, which is 2020, which is when COVID was present in the Czech Republic but was not officially acknowledged. People
Mm.
were getting sick, and they had all the symptoms that were associated with, the early wave, loss of smell, high fevers, cough, these sorts of things. The story Lupercalia wove together mythological motifs, wolf motifs, motifs of something being present that was affecting people that wasn't officially acknowledged. And from there, it just kept going. The impulse to write and to create stories and narratives.
I mean, that's really amazing because I guess when I asked you, was there a primal scene for the white deer, I was asking the wrong question. Because actually, there was a primal scene for you as a writer, which was that scene. And what an amazing sort of initiatory experience. Like to be chased by a herd of horses and to run through a gap in the hedge, like that is not anodyne, that it was through a gap in the hedge, onto the burnt mountain to Baba Yaga's hut. Like, you know, I think that it sounds like you either in the way that you perceived the experience, or I mean, when you recount it, it sounds sort of obvious that it's like full of mythological weight and metaphor, but that you stepped suddenly into the other world, into the world of stories at that moment, and you know, thereby the birth of a writer, huh?
Yes, it was an initiatory moment. It absolutely was, because although I had quit my academic teaching job at the end of 2019, I hadn't decided to write fiction. I had this essay about the white deer that I had been developing since its first version originated. But from that moment on, I had a need to create fiction as well, not just the nonfiction.
Well, it has been for me because I guess we got to know each other um, through kind of mutual acquaintances and colleagues and different kind of working groups. We kind of got to know each other around that time, like around sort of the not quite the beginning of the COVID lockdowns, but like not long after. And therefore, I have had the pleasure and the privilege. Like I remember reading your Lupercalia story when you wrote that, and reading the early versions of the White Deer that were an essay, and you know, reading your dystopian fiction that you've been working on, reading your newer novella. Um, it has been amazing to see this stuff. And like I said, um, it feels almost like your whole um, your whole background, your training in academia and in the kind of the different subjects, sort of literary and art history and eco criticism and all of that stuff, that all of that gave you this kind of a substrate where you didn't even know that you were preparing, but you seemed to have been preparing to write also this kind of fiction.
If you would have asked me, or if someone would have asked me 5 years ago, what would I really like to write? What would I really like to do? It definitely would have been something like The White Deer, except I didn't quite know it then. I wouldn't have been able to formulate it. It took some time. And you, Mark, have also been a very key part of the entire process. Seeing some of the early efforts and giving me the encouragement I needed to think, well, this is worth pursuing. This might get other people, interested, and it could spark some conversations that are worth having. So I have a huge debt of gratitude to you personally, for being there the whole way through this.
Well, don't say debt. Gratitude is fine. There is nothing owed. There's nothing owed. Um, but
I'm extremely grateful, Mark. Thank you for all of your support.
well, like I said, it has been an honor to be a part of it and to see it. But I think that yes, this kind of work, this kind of essay that ties together our concerns, um, both about our society, about our literature, about our mythology, and about our present moment, our ecological moment, our political moment. I think that this is the kind of work, and I think that there's a few other writers out there doing kind of similar work. People like Martin Shaw, people like Sophie Strand, um, people, and Reed Wildermuth himself, of course. There's people who are thinking along these lines and thinking like it is no longer enough to present people with facts and arguments about our situation. We have to explore where we are in the story. You know, we have to explore where we
Yes.
are in the myth because there is no other way of us working together or getting out if we don't figure out where we are in the story.
Yes. And if we don't open up that space of wonder, which I think that all of the people you just named are very good at doing.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so,
We
we
have
have. Sorry, there's a bit of interference there. We have people in America, um, sightings of the book The White Deer in the wild, arriving at people's homes. The physical copies in Europe are on the way. We have digital ebook copies are already available, and I'll put the links in the show notes to show where people can order them, where they can purchase them. Um, and I can say really very confidently that if any of if you are listening to this, all seven of you, if you are listening to this, you're going to love this book because it is absolutely in the heart of the subject, in the blank of the target of what this is all about, which is the intersection between art and craft and myth and literature and magic and wonder and enchantment, which is the place that I think we're all aiming for, right? Um, and I cannot recommend it highly enough. I really look forward to, um, reading and exchanging about your current work and about my current work, because you do the same for me. I send you my stuff. And, you know, I just want to congratulate you on your book coming out. I think it's a great triumph, and I look forward to many, many more from you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Greatly appreciate it. If
Right.
anyone is still waiting for their copy of The White Deer to arrive, or if they're not quite sure if this is something that they want to read, I would like to suggest that they look up my blog on Substack. And
Ooh.
in the blog, they will get samples of writing, which the first few articles are sort of tangential to The White Deer. So I don't repeat material. I sort of like what you described as DVD extras.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. So actually, I'll stick that in there too, because Melinda, you've just started a Substack, and I think that it's a great format too, because as you say, you've taken elements, particularly I think like the art history elements, like the depictions of the white deer, and you've given us these little sort of vignettes and little kind of mini essay sort of ramifications, embroideries around the main chapters of your book. And I think that that's going to be a really fruitful, really interesting exploration that people will enjoy joining you on. And so, yeah, I'm gonna put a link to your Substack in the show notes as well, and to other information, as like I said, information for ordering the book, information for learning more about it and about your work. And yeah, what a pleasure to talk to you about all of this. And I will speak to you again soon.
Thank you
And
so much, Mark.
everyone else, well, who knows? I might speak to you soon too. You never know. Thank you. And that is the end of
Surprise. Thank you.
Bye bye, everyone.